Welcome to the Harvard Catholic Forum. I'm Deacon Tim O'Donnell, the Executive Director, and I'm delighted to welcome you, both those who are here at Cater Hall and the Harvard Divinity School and on the live stream. We're all looking forward to the presentation and conversation on Professor VanderWeele's groundbreaking work on the Theology of Health. And co-presenting tonight's program are the Initiative on Health, Spirituality, and Religion and the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard. And I want to thank both of them for the exceptional collaboration and support. Before proceeding to the introductions, allow me to say a brief word about the Harvard Catholic Forum. We offer lectures, non-credit courses, workshops, and sacred music programs where the Catholic intellectual and cultural tradition engages both the university community and the wider public. Check out our website at harvardcatholicforum.org, where you can sign up for our program announcements, register for future events, watch past programs on our archive, and support our important mission by making a financial contribution. Tonight's lecture will be archived on the Harvard Catholic Forum YouTube channel, so please share that link to that channel with those who could not be with us tonight. We always have more views on the archive than on day one. So several thank yous are in order. First, to our co-sponsors, the Clough School of Theology and Ministry at Boston College, the Guild of St. Luke, the Harvard Christian Alumni Society, the Illumine Network, and the Catholic community at Stanford. This program is supported by a grant from the Lumen Christi Institute with funding from the John Templeton Foundation, and we also thank the Lee Family Fund for generous support. So let me give you a run of tonight's event. Professor VanderWeele's presentation will last about 30 minutes. And this will be followed by a response from Professor Dominic Doyle, and then some Q&A from the audience. Those of you who are here in person should have received a note card and pencil when you came in. If you are lacking a note card and pencil, please put your hand up, and somebody should be able to bring you one if you came in at the last minute. And if you have a question, please write it on the card. And during Professor Doyle's response, some of my colleagues will come up the aisles, and if you have a card with a question, raise your hand at that time and hold up the card. After the response, they will come through again to pick up a second and final set of questions. So again, raise your hand and hold up the card at that time. Please think of some good questions. We're looking forward to that conversation. I'll pass on as many questions as I can. Unfortunately, we're unable to take questions from the live stream audience today. And here's an important request. Please help us to evaluate and improve our programs by filling out the 2-minute survey, which in-person registrants got with your cards when you came in. Everyone who registered on Zoom will get an online survey after the event. So please open that email and take a couple of minutes to click through. Thank you for your help. And finally, right after the lecture, please walk right down the hall to the Braun Room at the end of the hall and join us for the reception. So our presenter tonight, Tyler VanderWeele, has taught at Harvard since 2009, where he is the John L. Loeb and Francis Lehman Loeb Professor of Epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and Director of the Human Flourishing Program and co-director of the Initiative on Health, Spirituality, and Religion at Harvard. His writing and teaching address psychosocial measurement theory, psychiatric and social epidemiology, the science of happiness and flourishing, and the study of religion and health. In addition to publishing over 500 papers in peer-reviewed journals, he has authored several books, including Handbook of Religion and Health in 2023 and A Theology of Health from 2024, the subject of this talk. Professor VanderWeele has a BA in philosophy and theology, as well as an MA in mathematics from Oxford. an MA in Applied Economics from Wharton, and a PhD in Biostatistics from Harvard. Our respondent, Dominic Doyle, is Associate Professor of Systematic Theology at the Boston College Clough School of Theology and Ministry. His writing and teaching cover theological anthropology, the theology of culture, grace, and Thomistic thought, among other topics. Most recently, Professor Doyle led the Clough School's Neuroscience Education for Theological Training, sponsored by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Dialogue on Science, Religion, and Ethics. He has an MTS from the Harvard Divinity School and a PhD in Systematic Theology from Boston College. So, thank you, and please give a hand to our speaker.
Well, thank you, Deacon Tim, for the kind introduction. Thanks to the Harvard Catholic Forum and all the co-sponsors for hosting this event, and thank you all for being here this evening on this event on the Theology of Health. This book came out of my teaching here at Harvard University on a course that was entitled Religion, Well-Being, and Public Health. The course was mostly oriented towards empirical data on the role of religious communities and health. And certainly community is an important topic from the perspective of Christian theology. But as I was teaching this material, I wondered, is this really the heart of what the Christian faith has to say concerning health? We talk a great deal in Christian life about love. Where does love come into play in our discussions in public health? Or sin? Is that concept at all relevant in thinking about matters of health and ill health? Or what are we to make of the fact that in the Gospels, when we read that Jesus says, your faith has healed you, the literal Greek is your faith has saved you. What is that relationship between healing and salvation? And so over the years, as I was teaching this course, I spent some time reflecting on these questions, eventually incorporating some of this material into the final lecture of the course. I'm coming at this topic, I said at the very end, from the perspective of my own tradition, the Christian tradition, and encouraging the students who represented a wide range of faith traditions to think critically about what they meant by health. We talk about this sometimes at the orientation sessions at the School of Public Health and maybe occasionally at commencement, but if we're aiming at health at the School of Public Health, how are we to understand this concept? And while a great deal had been written on the theology of health care, what it means to be a good clinician, for example, much less had been written on theology of health. So this book, after about 10 years of reflection on these matters, was an attempt to try to address as best as I could understand these matters. The book was published last year by University of Notre Dame Press, available there and on Amazon, but also available for free, download as a PDF through Project Muse. I'll make a few remarks on the structure of the book, then provide an overview of some of its contents, and go on to talk about what I see as the implications of the book. The book is structured in 3 parts: creation, fall, and grace. Each part has a central proposition and then several sub-propositions and some sub-sub-propositions. An overview of the whole content of the book can be found in the appendix, where I simply provide that propositional structure and outline. The book also has a non-theological appendix, providing an exposition of what I would take to be the relevance of the content of the book and its material for a pluralistic society, for those who might not share Christian perspective on these topics. Much of that concerns the implications of this proposed theology of health. So part 1 is health and wholeness. The central proposition here, and I'll go through each of these in more detail, is that health is wholeness as intended by God. Part 2 of the book, ill health and sin, central proposition there is the cause of ill health is sin, not necessarily one's own sin, but sin and the nature of sin in general. Part 3, healing and salvation, the restoration and fulfillment of health is salvation. Perhaps more concise summary of the whole of the content of the book could be found in the opening of Augustine's Confessions. Thou hast made us for thyself, O Lord, health and wholeness. Our heart is restless, ill health and sin, until it finds its rest in thee, healing and salvation. Okay, so part one, health and wholeness. Health is to be understood as wholeness as intended by God. And the distinction running throughout the book is between health of the body and health of the person. There's a large philosophical literature on the concept of health, much of which is trying to locate the breadth of the concept. Is this to be understood more narrowly or more expansively? The World Health Organization's definition of health from 1948, still in place today, is that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. That definition has come under considerable critique, and much of the literature on the concept of health is devoted to critique of that definition as being overly broad, not something we can accomplish in practice, too much to ever try to aspire to with regard to what a clinician or the public health community could possibly carry out. And so much of this literature is trying to place health on the spectrum from a more narrow to a more broad conception. But I think a lot of this literature and a lot of this dispute can be resolved by simply acknowledging that we have two separate concepts of health. Health of the body, essentially the body's systems and parts are operating as they characteristically do to give rise to and allow for the functionality that we usually observe with regard to human persons. So it's health of the body versus health of the person, perhaps synonymous with human flourishing, a state sort of which all aspects of a person's life are good. And we can find use of both of these concepts even in the same sentence. We might say, well, he's physically healthy, but he's not a healthy person. He spends his entire life socially isolated in his room. There we have both concepts present together. And so the book seeks to provide a theology both for the health of the body and for the health of the person, or wholeness and human flourishing. I had noted earlier that the World Health Organization's definition of health had often been critiqued as being too broad. But really from a Christian understanding, and I would say from the understanding of most world religions, it's in fact too narrow. And so what's proposed in the book is that our understanding of the health of the person or flourishing should really be complete physical, mental, social, and spiritual well-being. And in fact, there has been a history of attempts to modify that World Health Organization definition of health to include spiritual well-being. The World Health Organization has, I think, quite understandably been resistant to these efforts, because as soon as they open the door for one modification of the definition, it would open a can of worms, and the disputes that have taken place over these years would probably be unresolvable. But to try to accommodate this, we've sometimes referred to this broader definition of the health of a person as the WHO plus definition of health. To acknowledge the original definition, but to say really, if we're thinking about flourishing, if we're thinking about health of the person, spiritual well-being is central also. Argues that really complete person, body and soul, was created good by God as an integrated whole. The body itself has remarkable capacity often to heal itself. The body's also not independent of the rest of the person. What happens to one part of the person affects what happens to the person as a whole. Our physical health can affect our capacity to pursue our goals and purposes, to engage in relationships. But likewise, our physical well-being is itself affected by our psychological state, by our relationships, by our spiritual life, as indeed the empirical literature has increasingly made clear. So if we are to care for the person as a whole, we need to take into account this interconnectedness, and I'll come back to that in thinking about the implications of this notion of the health of a person. I think understood as a state of complete physical, mental, social, and spiritual well-being. That health of a person or flourishing entails also a flourishing community. If we think about flourishing or the health of a person as a state, relative attainment of a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, that would include one's communities as well. And I think this can perhaps be used to distinguish between well-being and flourishing. Well-being often has the connotation of really just pertaining to the individual, whereas I think flourishing includes connotation of the environment around oneself being conducive to growth. So the community's well-being is a part of one's own flourishing, both because it affects one's capacity to flourish, one's own well-being, but also because of one's participation in the common good of the community. And lastly, from a Christian perspective, and also that of many of the world's religions, complete health of the person includes a communion with God. And that really is central to the Christian understanding. And in some sense, that aspect of spiritual well-being is what is most important, as I will discuss in due course. Often the sort of spiritual ends that a person may be seeking are consonant with the physical, mental, social ends that may be sought. But sometimes the two can come into conflict. And when that is the case, from a Christian perspective, that notion of spiritual well-being, that pursuit of communion with God is what is to be prioritized. But that very possibility of that division kind of leads to the second part of the book, ill health and sin. So the central proposition here is the cause of ill health is sin, not necessarily one's own sin. And we read in the gospel accounts, for example, in the Gospel of John with the man born blind, when crowds ask Jesus, who sinned, this man or his father? He says neither, but that the glory of God may be demonstrated. So the relation between sin and ill health is complex, but if health is understood as wholeness, as intended by God, and sin in some sense is understood as a intentional, willful deviation from God's intent, then in some sense it's almost tautological that sin itself is constitutive of ill health. It is a deviation from God's intent. It is a lack of spiritual well-being. So that sin is a cause of ill health, I think, from the definitions proposed in the book would essentially follow, but that sin is the cause of ill health requires argument. But we can see fairly clearly that in some cases ill health does follow from the wrongful actions of ourselves or others. Cases of violence or rape or discrimination very clearly can give rise to ill health. And I think we do maybe not use the term sin within public health, but we do acknowledge these forms of moral wrongdoing. That, of course, is not the only way in which wrongful action can give rise to ill health. Wrong actions can give rise to unjust structures that may result in ill health or lack of flourishing over extended periods of time and even across generations if nothing is done to alter these structures. And I do think this is a topic that the public health community rightly takes quite seriously. But there's a corporal, a communal aspect to sin giving rise to ill health. From many understandings within the Christian traditions, it is also the case that human nature itself has somehow been disrupted by sin. We not infrequently will have the experience of our desires or passions pushing us in a different direction than we think is right according to our reason. Or sometimes our desires can be conflicted with one another. Our desire and will can be in conflict. And this itself is in some sense an imperfect state. Sin or human wrongdoing has brought about and continues to bring about death. In some ways, this is simply by way of efficient cause. Again, violence, murder can bring about ill health and subsequently death. But it can also be understood at a spiritual level, that kind of willful deviation from what God intended brings about a sort of spiritual death as well. If we take these notions seriously, then ill health cannot be addressed without also addressing sin, without addressing notions of human wrongdoing. And that experience of our brokenness, of our lack of wholeness, of the absence of flourishing, is itself what is suffering, and that suffering also makes clear our need and gives rise to a desire for restoration of health, for healing. Which brings me to the third part of the book, the restoration and fulfillment of health is salvation. And so it's not just from Christian understanding the restoration of health, so restoration to a prior state that we desire, but in some sense a fulfillment, a going beyond that as well. We desire for grace to perfect nature, our longing for the transcendent, perhaps suggests something beyond what we've experienced or can imagine in this life. And I think from a Christian perspective, the principal ways that this restoration and fulfillment of wholeness are brought about is through love of God and love of neighbor. God's love for us, and subsequently our love for our pursuit of our seeking God, and that of our neighbor as well, trying to bring healing and wholeness to others in our life. We cannot fully bring that about ourselves in spite of our best efforts. We do not ever fully overcome human wrongdoing. We need help. We need assistance. Christian perspective that has come through Jesus Christ. God has brought healing and salvation through Jesus Christ. How this is understood precisely varies in different parts of the Christian tradition, but some sense in the life of Jesus, in his birth and incarnation, there is a restoration of human nature, and in his life, in his teaching, in his healing, in his care for others. He gives us an example that we are to follow, an example of love. In his death, his taking in some way sin and wrongdoing upon himself, and his resurrection bringing new life, and his ascension and sending the Spirit, and the creation of the church, pathways to healing and wholeness. And thus the church itself is called to be both agents and recipients of that healing. We ourselves are in need of healing within the church, but we are to try to bring that healing and that love, that salvation to others. And that healing comes about through communal life, forgiveness, prayer, fasting, the sacraments, growth in character, the care for others, including the work of medicine. But in spite of all of these efforts, which do and can bring healing, bring some degree of restoration, there are limits to what we can accomplish. And so Christian faith is that fulfillment of wholeness, that complete communion with God, that completion of God's intent comes only with the resurrection and the life to come, and will be accomplished by God, that we await in hope that fulfillment. The remaining time, I want to discuss what I take as the implications of this work. Each of these three sections concludes with a discussion of the implications, and again, much of which is also discussed from a non-theological perspective in the book's postscript. But with regard to part one, in discussions of health, I think greater clarity is needed whether we have in mind the health of the body or the health of the person. And I think a lot of the disputes that take place, not all, but many, could be resolved by clarifying what is in view in any particular instance. That, of course, does not resolve all matters. There are still real difficulties around, for example, what is the proper purview of medicine, and the proposal put forward in the book and in related papers is that notion that medicine's only about health of the body is too narrow, because certain decisions about the body, certain treatment decisions, may have side effects that affect the life of the person in other ways. And yet, the health of the person would be too broad for medicine to take on. The clinician's not interchangeable with a life coach or a marital counselor, a pastor, a priest. Each of these helping professions has distinctive roles with regard to the health of the person, with regard to human flourishing. So the proposal put forward in the book is that the purview of medicine includes the health of the body, but includes also those aspects of the health of a person or a person's flourishing that are affected by or pertain to decisions about the health of the body. So whenever clinicians in context where a decision will have implications for the person's flourishing more broadly, that needs to be taken into account, and I will be coming back to that point. Proposals also put forward that the proper purview of psychiatry would be the wholeness of the mind as it pertains to the proper functioning of the brain, essentially that interface between the health of the body and mental health, but also those aspects of the health of the person, of flourishing, which the psychiatrist and patient agree together through dialogue to address. So this proposal allows for kind of a variability in the practice of psychiatry in contexts where the values of the psychiatrist and the patient may be more aligned. The purview may be the whole health of the person, but it would also allow psychiatrists to practice a much address a much narrower set of considerations concerning mental health in a more narrow sense. Given that the health of the person or flourishing will be understood differently across different traditions, I think there's arguably room for tradition-specific practices of medicine, taking into account the values and the priorities of different understandings of flourishing, different religious traditions. We would have a long way to go from where we are today to accomplish this vision. But if one looks, for example, at practice of China, one is offered the option of Western medicine or more traditional medicine. And I think one could conceive, potentially, of a system where, at least in some contexts, similar options, where resources allowed were provided. My colleagues Michael and Tracy Balboni at Harvard Medical School have an entire book on this topic, from hostility to hospitality, trying to lay out a vision for how this might be possible, having a shared common scientific knowledge base, but again, allowing for a greater incorporation of matters of spirituality, religion, and values into clinical care. I think perhaps even more difficult questions of the proper purview of public health and public policy. Much of this in practice is often restricted to matters of physical health and financial considerations, but what I propose in the book is that proper purview of public health and public policy really ought to be those aspects of the health of the person or flourishing around which consensus can be attained. And I believe in what we're trying to do at the Human Flourishing Program here at Harvard is to broaden that consensus. While I do think health and financial considerations are important, are critical, nearly everyone also wants to be happy, to have a sense of meaning in life, cares about trying to be a good person, cares about their relationships. These are other things around which I think there can be broad societal consensus and should be taken into account in public health and public policy. And therefore, I think assessments of these other aspects of well-being should be made in clinical contexts, but also in public health and public policy context. We should be asking about matters of psychological, social, perhaps even spiritual well-being. And I do think an exclusive focus on the health of the body within medicine ultimately leads to poor decision-making. Not long ago, I had a surgeon come to me and say, Tyler, we know from our randomized trials that our surgeries improve years of disease-free survival. There can be no dispute about that. But I'll have patients coming back to me 6 months later saying they want to die because the side effects have been so bad. Again, these are effects of medicine on the health of the person. These need to be taken into account in our decision-making. Well, psychological theories of well-being, I think, do incorporate a number of these elements. Often they ignore matters of bodily health, of character, and of the communal context of communal well-being. So I think even within this psychological well-being literature, this needs to be supplemented with other notions. Again, I think because health of the person includes, the community includes our relationships, we should begin more regularly measuring, discussing, aiming for better communities, better relationships. Some advances have been made in this regard. More recently, in 2023, the former U.S. Surgeon General released an advisory on loneliness as a public health crisis. The United Kingdom now has a minister of loneliness. So these are, I think, to my mind, important steps in the right direction. Perhaps more controversially, I think even in the context of a pluralistic society like our own, given that matters of religion and spirituality are important to so many, and for many are the most important element of well-being, I don't think it would be unreasonable to carry out tradition-specific assessments of spiritual well-being, to be able to allow communities, different faiths, to assess their progress or not towards those ends that they deem most important. And I think in principle this could inform, though precisely how to do so would of course be complex decisions with regard to public policy. But if these are the values that are most deeply held by so many in the population, I think these too should be taken into account. Then finally, because health of the body and health of the person are ideals, things we never perfectly achieve in this life, health in both senses really is a relative concept. And I think we can promote health of the person flourishing even in the absence of health of the body. Somewhat more briefly, section implications on ill health and sin. I think human wrongdoing should not be overlooked as a cause of ill health. And again, we do this to a certain extent within the medical and public health communities, and often not using those terms exactly, but we do attempt to address matters of violence, of rape, of discrimination, of other forms of wrongdoing. But I think trying to frame it in terms of not just harmful action, but that with moral content, points to another, what I would take as an implication of this material, which is that I think the character of a person needs to be emphasized in health and in ill health. This pertains to our lives individually, but certainly pertains to lives of our nations and world's leaders as well. If we abandon notions of character, of the moral content of our actions, wrongdoing is likely to not only persist, but gets worse. And so I think more can be done, and I'll come back to this momentarily, to promote positive character in our society. The social nature of wrongdoing, injustices, unjust structures from the past need to be addressed in order to maintain health as well. And I think we've rightly seen tremendous emphasis on this in recent decades, more work to be done, but again, I think this is something the public health community and much of society takes seriously. To my mind, from traditional Christian perspective, to promote health, work needs to be done also on respect for life, on the averting of abortion and euthanasia. I believe that also is critical to maintaining health. Health itself is contingent upon life. And to my mind, this pertains not just to matters of law and legal dispute, but more centrally to creating a culture where health is embraced, addressing the needs and challenges that women with an unwanted pregnancy are facing with regard to financial considerations, social difficulties, and so on and so forth. But again, health itself is contingent on life. Care for the environment, I think, also critical to maintaining health. And again, the public health community and our research there has made that very clear, and the Christian tradition likewise, I think, makes that very clear. We've got a long way to go, of course, But health will only be preserved as best as possible if we also care for our environment, care for creation. Next, the notion that we will ultimately overcome ill health and death in this life is a fiction, one that we should resist. Ultimately, all die. And I think this has important implications for resource allocation. In the United States, a large proportion of our total healthcare spending is in the last 6 months of life, is perhaps oriented to try to extend life rather than to contribute to the health of the person. I think medicine, public health, public policy should be attentive to questions of suffering and not just mental disorders and physical disease. The Journal of the American Medical Association does not allow the use of the word suffering unless it's suffering from some disease. But I think we need to take into account the human experience of ill health, of brokenness. And finally, medicine, public health, public policy should be attentive to and address phenomena of moral injury. This notion was brought to attention in the scientific literature through care of veterans, where treating PTSD often was not sufficient. They had experienced or had committed themselves some act that shook the foundation of their moral understanding, their notions of right and wrong, the goodness of themselves or others or institutions. And we need, for healing, for restoration, to address the moral aspects of our actions. And then finally, implications of the third section, healing and salvation. Medicine and public health, I think, need to pay greater attention to the psychological, social, and spiritual pathways towards healing. And the empirical research has increasingly made clear that these have profound implications for spiritual health as well. 30% reductions in all-cause mortality over 10 to 30 years for those attending religious services once a week versus not at all. Purpose in life, likewise, profound effects on health and mortality. We need to make use of these psychological, social, and spiritual pathways. I think more could be done for public health and medical institutions to partner with religious institutions in advancing common ends of health and healing. There can be tensions and divisions in this regard as well, and the book wrestles with some of those matters, but I think coming together on common ends is important. Perhaps more controversially, I think, given the empirical work on religious communities and health, I think even within a medical context, participation in religious community could be encouraged for those who already positively self-identify with a religious tradition. This is not saying you should become religious because of the health benefits, but rather you already hold these beliefs. Might you consider participating in communal life, which has these profound, powerful effects? Are we doing harm if we withhold this information? I think other forms of community participation should be supported and encouraged to promote health and healing for those who do not identify with a religious tradition. As I said earlier, I do think character promotion should be done at local and national and international scales. We have interventions from randomized trials on promotion of gratitude, forgiveness, compassion, perseverance. These are things which we could now widely employ. I do think forgiveness should be promoted at local, national, and international scales as well. We've completed a randomized trial of 4,500 participants in 5 relatively high conflict countries: Colombia, South Africa, Ukraine, Indonesia, and Hong Kong, showing that a simple self-directed forgiveness workbook distilling about 30 years in clinical psychology not only promoted forgiveness, but reduced depression, reduced anxiety, improved hope, improved flourishing. These are resources that we can disseminate widely to help with individual flourishing, but also healing and reconciliation within communities. Love, I think, also should be promoted at local, national, and international scales to foster health and healing. And I think the empirical evidence on this also is quite compelling now. I also think love needs to be promoted to ensure what the World Health Organization claims as a right to the highest attainable standard of health. We want to uphold that as best as possible. I think there's no way to do that without love. If that health of the person includes social well-being, we need, as individuals and as community, love. In the context of a pluralistic society, there should be open dialogue concerning how different communities understand health of the person, and ultimately what's most important, so that we can identify common ground, but also identify our disagreements and differences and try to find ways to navigate those. We take seriously that health of the person includes that spiritual well-being, then I think just individuals and communities should be free, and effort should be made to protect and ensure the freedom that these individuals and communities have to pursue these more ultimate goals and ends in promoting health of the body and health of the person. Thank you all for listening. I look forward to Dominic Doyle's comments, and I look forward to your questions as well.
Thank you, Tim, for the introduction, and to all the co-sponsors, including the Catholic Forum. And thank you, Tyler, for your marvelous talk. I just want to say amen and end there and have the conversation. But it's been an enormous privilege getting to know Tyler and his extraordinary work, which is a very rare interdisciplinary combination of three elements. One, a mastery of the empirical data on an issue of great importance, human happiness and well-being. Two, a rigorous philosophical analysis of the concepts that generate and guide all those empirical studies. And in the book we're recognizing today, the ability to set these data and concepts within an encompassing theological horizon. We are in your debt, and so I want to begin with a vote of thanks for how you have shared your astonishing gifts, not without cost, at the service of two masters, secular academia and the Catholic Church. I have three questions, which they shouldn't be made from the same person. I just throw them out to get the conversation going. The first is asking you to amp up your theology in some areas, for example, in the limits of dialogue. The second is maybe saying in other areas it might be toned down, for example, the connection between death and sin, or perhaps modified. And the third is just to offer some reflections on your rare ability to engage in this interdisciplinary dialogue in the context of the history of this project of trying to integrate science and religion. As we saw from the slides, the threefold structure of health, ill health, and the restoration and fulfillment of health is a very clear and helpful organizing principle for the work. In a way, it applies the classic loci of theological anthropology, nature, sin, and grace, to the field of public health. The book, then, is a great example of the Thomistic balancing act that wants to distinguish nature from grace without separating them in order to relate them intelligibly. To do so, it draws on two basic Thomistic convictions. One, the natural desire for God, that the human person is open upwards to the infinite. And two, in Aquinas' famous slogan, God's grace perfects human nature. Because the book shares this characteristically Catholic confidence in the relationship between nature and grace, or faith and reason, it is motivated by a very praiseworthy desire for dialogue between people of different faiths or no faith. Which leads me to my first question to Tyler. How's that going? How has the book been received, especially outside Catholic and even just theological circles? I ask because one of the reviews I read, I'm not sure of the book or of the Harvard Flourishing Project in SSM Mental Health, critiqued, quote, the entanglement of normative religious values and empirical methods, and concluded with the territorial warning, quote, social science and theology are fundamentally different from one another, end quote. We might extrapolate not only different, but also unequal. So to flesh out my first question, to the extent the reception of your book is hostile or the same result indifferent, is there required a shift in your theological mode at times from the generous dialogue to a more robust dialectic? That is, from an optimistic elaboration of what we have in common to a realistic recognition of where we disagree. And so must there come a reckoning that these disagreements cannot be overcome with any more empirical data, because that new evidence will just be interpreted according to one's prior commitments, but only by a radical change in one's horizon, what Bernard Lonergan calls some kind of intellectual, moral, and/or religious conversion. Finally, as these fundamental existential and religious issues come to the fore, will the Christian in the secular academy come to see the wisdom in Paul's shift from inspirational talks about the unknown God of the Athenians in Acts 17, which were largely unsuccessful, to his more typical strategy to, quote, preach Christ crucified, that is foolishness to the Gentiles, 1 Corinthians 1:23. To use Richard John Newhouse's words, if Christianity wants to make a difference to health, or anything else for that matter, if Christianity wants to make a difference, then it has to be different. And that difference, not the non-theological commonalities, is the decisive matter, the heart and center of any theological contribution. So that's the first question. Coming from a completely different angle, the second question, asking you not to amp up the theology, but to tone it down. There seems, and I'm not sure, maybe it's ambiguous, but there seem to be places where the theology and the theological commitments overdetermine or maybe even distort the content. For example, is it true to say that, quote, the cause of ill health is sin, from one of the earlier slides? Or in an other slide, quote, sin has brought about and continues to bring death. Maybe Paul did literally mean that sin brought about death, but is that really plausible in the light of evolution? It seems contestable and problematic to claim that defects in the world, such as death and suffering, are wholly the result of human agency, when many of these defects existed prior to the emergence of humankind. Let me put the question as follows. Are the consequences of sin death per se, following Paul's apodictic rhetoric, or, more likely perhaps, isolation and hopelessness, that is, spiritual death, as we face our natural mortality? To put it in Richard Bauckman's more positive framing, does God save us from death or through death? Does Christ's death substitute for ours by helping us avoid the cross, or does his Spirit instead give us the courage to face the cross? In its most basic form, is salvation God simply doing something for us, or is it ultimately God being with us now and at the hour of our death? So maybe what I'm saying is not so much to tone down the theology, but maybe modify it in light of new scientific evidence. And that would require a more substantial broadening of the theological sources from Aquinas and the Catechism. Not that I have anything against Aquinas and the Catechism. The final question, which goes against the question I've just asked, but just to throw it out to Tyler, who has this unusual combination of facility in the empirical sciences and in theology. It's not presumably easy to do this interdisciplinary work that spans the natural sciences and the humanities. And from my understanding of the history of that engagement between science and religion, it's not a happy, often, outcome. It is strewn with reductive adaptation of religion to contemporary science. For example, in the 17th and 18th century, Michael Buckley's book, The Origins of Modern Atheism, has traced the fatal contradiction as theologians overconfidently embraced the physics of the time and set up a fatal contradiction between using the impersonal evidence of physics to try and prove the existence of a personal God. Or, closer to home, 19th century James Turner, his book Without God, Without Creed, The Origins of Unbelief in America, charts the attempt to adapt belief in modernity to human standards and human goals, and thereby render belief irrelevant. It wasn't that science causes unbelief. The problem was that theologians, by relying too heavily on the sciences to try and ground their faith, and once science changes and develops, then belief becomes problematic. So I guess my question to you is, in your ability to be an amphibian across these two worlds, do you see any possibility of recurrence of that pattern, of a faulty strategy, but whereby Christians and theologians too eagerly embrace the science and then get hoisted on their own petard 10, 20, 50 years later? Thank you.
Dominic, for such fine probing questions. We could, of course, carry on with this discussion for hours, but want to give some the audience. I'll keep my remarks and responses relatively brief. With regards to the book's reception, the book suggests three desired audiences. The first one is sort of Christians working in public health and medicine. The second, or Christian world more broadly, and then the third, those who do not embrace the Christian tradition but are working in public health and medicine. And I would say the book has, in terms of its reception, has more or less been ignored by the first primary audience and the third. It has been mostly the broader Christian community that has, I think, read it, engaged with it, responded, although it is coming at these topics from a Catholic perspective and drawing heavily on Aquinas and the Catholic Catechism. It has been embraced well by the evangelical world as well. It recently won the Dallas Willard Book Award. But in terms of engagement with the medical and public health world more broadly, other than perhaps the one critic who you mentioned, who I think was more focused on the Human Flourishing Program than the book itself, it has not yet had much penetration. But I think the program itself has, and I'll come back to that, the Human Flourishing Program, shortly. With regard to fall and agency, this is a point where trying to dance about a bit with different interpretations within the book, as with much of the book, follows Aquinas on a number of these points, but this is not specific interpretations of these points. How the fall is to be understood, the effects on human nature is not something where I would put my stake in the ground and insist on. And I think many of the points in the book with regard to the division that we experience as human persons and the role of wrongdoing would be similarly applicable under different specific interpretations. So on this particular point, if I were wrong, as I indeed might be, it would not deeply affect my faith or commitments. In contrast, to say if my understanding of the resurrection of Jesus Christ were wrong, that would deeply affect how I saw other matters. And so one might disagree with the degree or level of ambiguity in the book in that second part of it, but again, I think much of the content and implications of the book would pertain under different interpretations as well. Finally, relation between theology and religion on the one hand, science on the other. The twofold aim of the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard is to study and promote human flourishing and to develop and implement systematic approaches to the synthesis of knowledge across disciplines. And I think we've made much more progress on the first part of that twofold aim than the second. I would very much acknowledge the difficulty of bringing these two disciplines together. And yet, I think this does need to be done. I think science itself is not sufficient for determining human action and decision-making. We do bring in values, understandings of the good, of well-being, of flourishing. And so in many ways, I feel there's no way around this particular interface. And I do think each discipline has opportunities to contribute to the life of the other. I think science can often provide material for theology or philosophy to reflect on. It can provide means to help attain ends and values which are identified. I think likewise, philosophy, theology can help bring conceptual clarity to the social sciences, can provide hypotheses to investigate, and can enrich the interpretation of our data. So I think this is often going on implicitly, regardless, and I think it is better to make it explicit and to work through some of those difficulties. And those difficulties become very clear when it comes to matters of disagreement and difference. And I think there's not necessarily a straightforward way to navigate those disagreements and differences. I think trying to understand them and also trying to find common ground, and I do believe, as I said before, there's greater common ground than is often seen or accepted. But I do think identifying those differences is also helpful. I do think our democracy in this country is one way to attempt to navigate those differences. Friends who might say that democracy itself is perhaps somehow contingent on a Christian perspective and foundation. I'm not sure I agree with that position, but I very much hope that the Christian faith in the church can do what it can to support that democracy, that way to try to navigate our disagreements and differences rather than hinder it. But thank you again.
What about asceticism and how that can foster or harm health?
So I discussed this only briefly in the book, but I think practices of asceticism, of fasting, of penance are areas in which sort of some giving up of, some sacrificing of what might be aspects of physical well-being can be helpful for spiritual ends. I think often, again, those spiritual ends are consonant with the ends of temporal flourishing, including physical health. But I think when the two come into conflict from a Christian perspective, it is those spiritual ends that are to be prioritized. And so while some degree of fasting and asceticism can be helpful even for physical health, I think in many cases it is the case that there can be a giving up of physical health in pursuit of those spiritual ends. Much more could be said, but I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Jesus tells us to bear our cross. What is the role of suffering in spiritual health? And I think maybe this means, is there a positive role of suffering in spiritual health? Should we aim to reduce suffering as much as possible?
I mean, I do think Christians and the church are to seek to reduce suffering, to provide for the needs of others, but I think there will not be full elimination of suffering in this life. And so there's also a role to try to transform the suffering that we do experience for good. Suffering is sometimes taken as an antonym for flourishing. I think that's not quite right. I do think suffering always indicates some absence of flourishing, some good that is absent or has been lost. But suffering can also be a tremendous source of growth. Suffering can help clarify our understanding of things, a finding of a deeper meaning, clarify our purposes, sometimes deepen relationships, help with growth in character, help with our spiritual pursuits. I think also, from a Christian perspective, suffering can sometimes be voluntarily embraced in the pursuit of some good, of helping others. We may give up our own well-being for the pursuit of some noble cause to alleviate the suffering of others. And I think that itself is in some sense part of our own flourishing. As I said, my understanding is that the community's well-being is a part of an individual's flourishing. So although there may be suffering, that contribution that we make to the community's well-being is part of our own flourishing. Not long ago I was asked by a Jewish colleague, Tyler, was Jesus flourishing on the cross? I immediately responded yes, and then thought for days following, what on earth does that mean? And as I reflected on this matter, that notion that the community's well-being is part of our own flourishing helped me to make sense of that. From a Christian perspective, what was happening on the cross for the salvation of the world, the contribution to the world's subsequent well-being, was extraordinary, unfathomable, and that itself was part of his own flourishing. So again, I think the relation between suffering and flourishing is complex, but suffering can, voluntarily embraced, be in fact part of our flourishing.
Dominic, would you like to comment on that? Okay. This question says, what does character mean in the context of health? I want to maybe suggest, what does character mean in the context of medical care, perhaps, of actually of promoting health? How, what role would that play?
Yeah, so I mean, I take character to be something along the lines of one's acquired dispositions that enable or hinder one from attaining either one's purposes and goals or what is good. And I do think there is a powerful role for character formation within education, and from that perspective, I think there's a role for for public policy, for public health even, to try to promote good character in society, compassion for others, a sense of gratitude, forgiveness. We've learned a great deal from the empirical sciences how to do this well, and of course faith traditions have their own important, powerful role in shaping character. In terms of its role in health, there's plenty of empirical evidence that forgiveness, gratitude, perseverance all contribute to physical health outcomes as well. But I think we pursue character not simply for those ends of physical health, but both for its own sake and for the sake of what this does to the fabric of the community. And I think public health, public policy communities should pay more attention to these matters. The stance is sometimes criticized within public health and medicine as taking a blame the victim approach. If there's an instance of ill health, we may blame it on wrong decisions and character. And I do think one needs to be careful in that regard to avoid that sort of one-to-one correlation. But that's very different than saying there are ways we can promote in society good character, and that itself will have implications for the health and well-being of individuals and of society.
Thank you. So, what would be the next steps to bring this vision to healthcare professionals? And maybe I could ask this in terms of Dominic's point about moving from dialogue to dialectic. I think he was emphasizing a little bit more the tension between the theological vision and the empirical side.
No, I do think addressing matters as difficult as the proper interface between the biomedical and social sciences and theology, say, is not going to come about on its own. It's only going to come about by attempts, efforts, failures, practice, and I think this is something we should be doing in the university. I think there's been tremendous advancement in knowledge that has come about through specialization and a siloing of disciplines, but I think also something lost. I think modern university has in many ways advanced knowledge in tremendous ways, but also lost that more holistic vision of the integration of disciplines. So I would never want to pretend this is easy or straightforward, and I think some of the difficulties and challenges and frustrations that arise are some of the reason for our seemingly doing this less and less. But as I said earlier, I think in many ways, once it comes not just to academic study, but policy, practice, action, there is no way to completely separate the science from values, from interpretation, from ultimate ends. And so I think we'd be better off with more engagement rather than less despite the real difficulties.
Yeah.
I think it was one of your articles where you talked about how the person's religiosity as they're dying can often lead to the best and the worst outcomes. I can't remember which one article it was, but it was either people that have an acceptance of hospice care, they avoid costly, painful, very expensive end-of-life care that just is maybe in the interests of the family who don't want to let them go, but not in the interests of the person dying. Or it has, bad outcomes, praying for miracles, and sort of. So that's a good example. I think what you said in the article, when there's an integrated healthcare, the team of the chaplain, the psychological support, the medical support are integrated. And I think the Catholic vision, I mean, it's not exclusive to Catholics, of course, but that attempt to integrate the nature and grace into has a very positive outcome in terms of health, cost, decreasing suffering.
So this was a study that indicated, looking at end-of-life patients with cancer who all died within 3 to 6 months, whether they received spiritual care from their religious community or from the medical team. And those who received spiritual care from the religious communities were more likely to seek essentially useless, aggressive, costly treatments at the end of life. Those who are highly religious who received spiritual care were even more likely to seek costly, futile treatments. For those who received spiritual care from the medical team, which happens infrequently, even in end-of-life settings, but those who did, they were less likely to seek out futile, expensive medical treatments. Those who were highly religious and received spiritual care from the medical team were even less likely to seek out these futile, expensive medical treatments. And so the religiosity had this amplifying effect, but when the spiritual care was integrated with the medical care, it had really profound effects and implications. And so, as you said, Dominic, I think this is a very fine example of where that interface has considerable value in practice.
You emphasize the importance of social connection, community, and so on as a constituent element in health. We now have virtual communities. They do provide connection. It's not the same as traditional person-to-person kinds of communities. Where do you think the pluses and minuses are? Where are the boundaries of value in virtual communities?
To my mind, the value in virtual communities, and I might go so far as to say perhaps the only value in virtual communities, are when face-to-face communities are not accessible, are not possible. And that may have been the case for many during COVID. It can be the case for some when there are serious mobility or health challenges. But I think beyond that, there are almost no benefits as compared to face-to-face communities. While one finds profound effects of religious community participation on health and well-being when they're face-to-face, our studies of virtual religious community participation suggest a tiny, tiny effect in comparison. And I think the literature on social media and health and well-being has likewise indicated that while there can be positive uses, on average, the effects are harmful, are detrimental. And I am, in fact, most concerned about the relational aspects of artificial intelligence. Something like 50 to 80% of adolescents now report using relational chatbots regularly. And I think these make us less capable of engaging with human relationships. They set unrealistic expectations with regard to what those relationships look like and feel like. And if we are becoming less able to engage in real relationships and real communities, I think our flourishing has decreased, even if they temporarily alleviate loneliness. The long-term implications, I think, are very worrying. So while AI technologies in many ways simply confront us with the difficulties and challenges of any new technology, I do think what's happening with relationships and AI is something completely new and disturbing. I think it's a tiny fraction of what we saw with social media is what's ultimately going to play out unless we take action soon. So I think we are embodied, and we need other people. We need to be with other people face to face. So I do think virtual communities have some role, but I think whenever possible, those face-to-face relationships and communities are essential.
Good. Thank you both for coming, and thank you especially to our two speakers.